June 12th, 2022, a Sunday. For most people, it was an unremarkable morning. Coffee, a slow scroll through the news, the kind of day that doesn't announce itself as important. For roughly 1.7 million people who had trusted Celsius Network with their cryptocurrency, it was the morning they discovered that the money was gone. Not stolen, not yet anyway, just frozen, locked, inaccessible. A company-wide suspension of all withdrawals, swaps, and transfers buried in a 2-paragraph announcement on the Celsius blog, published without warning, without a press conference, without so much as an email to the customers whose life savings were now sitting behind a digital wall they couldn't breach. The announcement used careful language. It said Celsius was taking this action to stabilize liquidity. It said the company needed time to work through a difficult market environment. It said, and this is the line that made people's stomachs drop, that the decision was made in the interest of our community. The community had $11.8 billion deposited on the platform. By the time the announcement went up, Celsius was already insolvent. The money that customers believed was sitting safely in their accounts, earning those advertised yields of 8, 10, sometimes 17% annually, had been deployed into a series of increasingly desperate and increasingly reckless bets that had gone spectacularly wrong. The gap between what Celsius owed customers and what it actually had was not a rounding error. It was billions of dollars. The people who had deposited their savings into Celsius had been told repeatedly and loudly that their assets were safe, that Celsius was different from the casino that the rest of crypto looked like, that Alex Mashinsky, the company's founder, a man who had built a cult of personality around his status as a champion of the ordinary depositor against the predatory banks, was looking out for them. He wasn't. This is the story of how a company raised billions on the promise of doing finance better, then used those billions to do something far worse than anything it had promised to protect its customers from. It's a story about what happens when a charismatic founder's ego writes checks that his balance sheet can't cash. And it's a story about an industry that, at its most evangelical, had convinced a generation of people to trust systems they didn't understand with money they couldn't afford to lose. Let's start at the beginning. The real beginning. Not the IPO or the fundraising round, but the idea. Because the idea, at its core, wasn't crazy. Before Celsius was a company, it was a pitch. And before the pitch, it was a grievance. Alex Mashinsky was born in Ukraine in 1965, moved to Israel as a teenager, served in the Israeli military, and eventually made his way to New York in the early 1990s with the restless energy of someone who had decided that the United States was where things happened, and he was going to be one of the people making them happen. He was not wrong about his own ability to find opportunity. Over the next 2 decades, he built and sold several companies in the telecommunications space, including one that played a foundational role in the development of VoIP technology, the internet phone calling infrastructure that eventually became so ubiquitous, nobody thinks about it anymore. He was a legitimate tech entrepreneur, not a pretender, not a hype merchant with nothing underneath. He had actually built things, sold things, generated real value. By the time he founded Celsius in 2017, he had enough of a track record that investors didn't require him to prove himself from scratch. What drove him to Celsius was a specific, and if you were listening carefully, genuinely felt anger at the banking system. His argument went like this. Banks take your deposits, pay you effectively nothing in interest, somewhere between 0 and 1% in the years after the 2008 financial crisis, and then lend that money out to other customers at much higher rates, pocketing the spread as profit. The bank makes 8, 9, 10% on your money and gives you back a fraction of 1%. The rest is captured by shareholders, executives, and overhead. You, the depositor, are being systematically screwed by an industry that has no competition and no reason to treat you better. This argument was not wrong. The spread between deposit rates and lending rates at major banks was, and remains, a massive and largely invisible transfer of wealth from depositors to financial institutions. The regulatory environment that protects banks from competition also protects their margins. Ordinary people with savings accounts were, in the era of near-zero interest rates, genuinely receiving almost nothing on money that banks were using profitably. Mashinsky's proposition was simple on its surface. What if a company used crypto's infrastructure to cut out the middlemen, deploy depositors' assets more efficiently, and give most of the yield back to the people who provided the capital? Instead of keeping the spread, Celsius would share it. You deposit crypto, we deploy it, we earn returns, we give you 80% of those returns. We keep 20%. You earn somewhere between 5 and 17% annually, depending on the asset. Everyone wins. He called it unbank yourself. He showed up to conferences and YouTube interviews in a baseball cap that said, "Banks are not your friends." He called bankers parasites. He called himself a champion of the little guy. He had the energy of a revival preacher and the confidence of someone who genuinely believed he had found the answer to a problem that most people had accepted as unsolvable. People listened, people signed up, and then people told their friends. The product worked. In the early days, it genuinely worked. Celsius deployed depositor assets in the crypto lending market, lending Bitcoin and Ethereum and stablecoins to institutional borrowers who needed the assets for various purposes and were willing to pay meaningful interest rates for them. The yields Celsius earned were real. The yields it passed back to depositors were real. The 80-20 split was honored. The promise was being kept. Between 2018 and 2021, Celsius grew from a startup that nobody outside of crypto circles knew about to one of the dominant platforms in decentralized finance, accumulating billions in deposits from customers around the world who had decided that Mashinsky's pitch made sense and that the platform was delivering on it. At peak, Celsius had approximately $25 billion in assets under management. For comparison, that's larger than the GDP of about 80 of the world's countries. It was an extraordinary accumulation of capital for a company barely 4 years old, in an industry that hadn't existed a decade earlier. The growth felt like proof that the idea worked. It was also, it turned out, making the actual execution of the idea increasingly difficult, because as the assets under management grew, finding enough profitable deployment opportunities to generate the yield Celsius was promising became a harder and harder problem. A problem that Mashinsky and the people around him decided to solve in ways that customers knew nothing about. And the solutions they chose were the seeds of everything that followed. Here's the part of the story that Celsius's marketing never mentioned, the part that would have changed everything if depositors had understood it clearly. When you deposit money in a conventional bank, you're protected by a regulatory framework that constrains what the bank can do with it. There are capital requirements, minimums the bank must hold in reserve against potential losses. There are restrictions on investment activities. There is deposit insurance. In the US, the FDIC guarantees up to $250,000 per depositor if the bank fails. The bank can lend your money out, yes, but it operates within a cage of rules specifically designed to limit the downside for depositors when things go wrong. Celsius was not a bank. It was not regulated like a bank. It was not insured like a bank. Depositors' crypto assets were not protected by anything analogous to the FDIC. And the people at Celsius had enormous latitude to deploy depositor assets however they thought would generate the yields they'd promised. In the early days, the deployment was relatively straightforward. Celsius lent crypto assets to institutional borrowers, hedge funds, market makers, trading firms who needed liquidity and were willing to pay for it. This is a legitimate business. The counterparty risk was real but manageable, and the yields generated by this institutional lending were sufficient to fund the returns Celsius was promising depositors. But as the platform grew, two things happened simultaneously that created enormous pressure on the deployment strategy. First, competition. The crypto yield space attracted competitors fast. BlockFi, Nexo, Anchor Protocol, and eventually dozens of other platforms were all offering attractive yields on deposited crypto, competing for the same pool of customers. When your competitor is offering 19% and you're offering 17%, you either match it or explain why you can't. Mashinsky's instinct, repeatedly and consistently, was to match it, to maintain or increase the advertised yields as a competitive necessity, regardless of what the actual returns from the deployment strategy could support. Second, the crypto market's own dynamics. The institutional lending market that Celsius's early deployment strategy depended on was not infinitely scalable. As Celsius grew, it needed to find ways to deploy billions in depositor assets at yields high enough to fund the promises it had made. The straightforward institutional lending market was not generating enough returns at sufficient scale. So Celsius moved into more complex and more dangerous territory. The platform became a significant participant in the world of decentralized finance protocols, experimental, largely unaudited smart contract systems that offered high returns in exchange for accepting risks that were not always well understood by the people deploying capital into them. Celsius put customer deposits into liquidity pools, yield farming strategies, and emerging DeFi protocols that promised high returns but carried technical risks that a more cautious manager would have avoided. More dangerously, Celsius became deeply entangled with a number of counterparties whose financial health was intimately connected with Celsius's own. The most consequential of these relationships was with Three Arrows Capital, a crypto hedge fund run by Su Zhu and Kyle Davies that was, in 2021 and early 2022, one of the most prominent and most heavily leveraged funds in the crypto ecosystem. Celsius lent significant assets to Three Arrows, which deployed them in strategies that were generating extraordinary returns during the bull market. The flaw in that arrangement was that Three Arrows' strategies were heavily leveraged on the continued appreciation of crypto assets, particularly Bitcoin and Ethereum. The fund was not hedged for a downturn, and when the crypto market turned in late 2021 and early 2022, Three Arrows' positions started going underwater. What Celsius's depositors didn't know was that their assets were part of this chain. The money they had deposited, trusting in Mashinsky's promise that it was being managed safely and professionally, was sitting inside some of the most leveraged, most exposed positions in the entire crypto ecosystem. And the internal communications at Celsius, emails, Slack messages, internal reports that would later become exhibit material in bankruptcy proceedings, show that senior people at the company understood that the exposure was dangerous well before the public found out. The question was whether they told anyone, and the answer, put simply, was no. Every Friday, Alex Mashinsky hosted a YouTube broadcast he called Ask Mashinsky Anything. He sat in front of a camera, took questions from community members, and talked, sometimes for 2 hours straight, about Celsius, crypto, the future of finance, and the many ways in which traditional banks were robbing ordinary people. The broadcasts were a significant part of Celsius's marketing strategy, and more importantly, a significant part of Mashinsky's personal brand. He was not just a CEO doing investor relations. He was a movement leader, communicating directly with his community, positioning himself as the accessible, honest alternative to the buttoned-up executives at the institutions he condemned. He was very good at it. The broadcasts during 2021 and into 2022 are deeply uncomfortable to watch in retrospect. As Celsius's actual financial position was deteriorating, as the risky deployments were accumulating losses, as the counterparty exposures were growing more dangerous, as the gap between what Celsius owed depositors and what it could actually return was widening, Mashinsky was on camera telling his community that Celsius was different, that Celsius was strong, that the people criticizing the platform were jealous competitors or short sellers or bank shills who couldn't stand to see an honest alternative succeed. In December 2021, as Bitcoin had already fallen significantly from its all-time high and the crypto market was showing serious strain, Mashinsky went on a podcast and was asked directly whether Celsius was having any financial difficulties. He said no. He said the company was performing well. he did not disclose the mounting problems with counterparty exposures or the challenges in the deployment strategy. In May 2022, just weeks before the platform froze withdrawals, Mashinsky was publicly dismissing concerns about Celsius's stability. He tweeted that depositors should ignore FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt, from people who were wrong about the platform. He implied that the people raising questions about Celsius's solvency were bad actors trying to manipulate the market. The SEC would later allege that Mashinsky was actively manipulating the price of SEL, Celsius's own token, during this period, buying it publicly to signal confidence while the company was quietly selling it in ways that benefited insiders. The internal picture was very different from what the Friday broadcasts presented. Celsius's own financial team was, by early 2022, flagging serious concerns about the company's liquidity position. The collapse of the stablecoin Terra Luna in May 2022, one of the largest single events in crypto history, which wiped out approximately $40 billion in market value in a matter of days, hit Celsius with losses that the company was not in a position to absorb. Celsius had significant exposure to the Terra ecosystem, which was not something it had disclosed to depositors. The weeks between Terra Luna's collapse and the June 12th withdrawal freeze were, based on the communications later produced in bankruptcy proceedings, a period of escalating panic inside the company. People were trying to find ways to plug holes that were getting bigger faster than the plugs could be manufactured. Counterparties were calling in loans. Liquidity was draining. The math was not working. And Mashinsky was still on camera, still in the baseball cap, still telling the community everything was fine. It wasn't fine. It was ending. The announcement on June 12th was notable not just for what it said, but for what it didn't say. It didn't say that Celsius was insolvent. It didn't say that customer assets had been deployed in ways that had resulted in large losses. It didn't say that Three Arrows Capital, which filed for bankruptcy itself a few weeks later, had been a major counterparty to whom Celsius had lent significant customer assets. It didn't say that the company had been playing a version of financial Jenga for months, removing supporting pieces from an increasingly unstable structure and hoping the whole thing wouldn't fall. It said liquidity, stability, community. The reaction from depositors was immediate and visceral. Social media platforms, particularly Reddit and Twitter, lit up with a mix of panic, rage, and a specific kind of desperate bargaining that characterized people trying to process the possibility that money they needed was gone. Some people had deposits that represented their retirement savings. Some had converted significant portions of their net worth into crypto specifically because of the high yield Celsius was offering. Some were from countries with limited access to banking infrastructure and had seen Celsius as a more accessible alternative to systems that had historically excluded them. The human dimension of what happened on June 12th is important to keep in front of you through the financial and legal details that follow, because those details can make the story abstract in ways that obscure what actually happened to real people. A nurse in Ohio who had put $340,000 into Celsius, representing most of what she had saved over a 20-year career, woke up on June 12th and couldn't access any of it. A retired teacher in Texas who had moved a significant portion of his pension into Celsius for the yield couldn't get it out. People in Nigeria, the Philippines, Turkey, and dozens of other countries who had used Celsius as an alternative to unreliable local financial systems, countries where Mashinsky had specifically and repeatedly marketed the platform as a better option for people underserved by traditional banking, were locked out. The company, after the announcement, went largely silent. Mashinsky did not hold a Friday AMA. The company's communications team released periodic updates that contained minimal information. The legal and financial reality of what had happened was slowly emerging through bankruptcy filings and regulatory investigations, rather than through any proactive disclosure from the company itself. On July 13, 2022, a month after the withdrawal freeze, Celsius filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The filing disclosed something that the June 12th announcement had not. At the time time of the freeze, Celsius had a hole of approximately $1.2 billion between what it owed customers and what it actually had. The $11.8 billion in customer assets that had been frozen was not $11.8 billion in real recoverable value. It was a claim against an estate that was substantially insolvent. The bankruptcy filing also began to pull back the curtain on exactly what had happened to depositor assets. The disclosures in the filing, supplemented by court-ordered document productions in the months that followed, painted a picture of financial management that was, at best, reckless, and at worst, deliberately deceptive. And the man who had built the whole thing was about to find out what the Securities and Exchange Commission thought about the gap between what he'd said on those Friday webcasts and what his company had actually been doing. Bankruptcy proceedings are, among their other qualities, extraordinarily effective at producing information that companies would prefer to keep private. The court-supervised process requires disclosure of financial records, communications, and operational details that a normally operating company would never make public. For the depositors of Celsius, the bankruptcy process was how they finally started getting answers to the questions the June 12th announcement had refused to address. What the bankruptcy filings and the subsequent examiner's report, produced by independent legal and financial professionals appointed by the court to investigate Celsius's operations, revealed was a company that had operated with a level of financial recklessness that went far beyond the normal startup mistakes of poor forecasting and optimistic projections. The examiner's report, released in January 2023, was a remarkable document. It described a company that had deployed depositor assets into high-risk DeFi strategies without adequate risk management. It described concentration risks, large portions of depositor assets placed with single counterparties that any competent risk manager would have flagged as dangerous. It described internal warnings that were issued and ignored. And it described a gap between the external narrative that Mashinsky was presenting to depositors and the internal reality that his team was managing. A gap that the examiner characterized in ways that suggested not just mismanagement, but deliberate concealment. Specific numbers from the examiner's report tell a story that abstract descriptions of risky bets don't fully capture. Celsius had, at various points, deployed enormous sums into a DeFi protocol called Anchor Protocol on the Terra blockchain, the same protocol whose collapse in May 2022 was catastrophic for the broader crypto market. The exposure to Anchor was significant, and the decision to maintain and expand that exposure as warning signs were appearing was documented in internal communications that showed Celsius's risk team raising concerns that were not adequately acted upon. The Three Arrows capital exposure was particularly consequential. Celsius had extended significant credit to Three Arrows, a fund that was behind the scenes in serious financial difficulty months before its public collapse. When Three Arrows went down, it took a large chunk of Celsius's deployer capital with it. The losses from this single counterparty relationship were by themselves enough to create serious solvency concerns. What made the Three Arrows situation more damaging was that it was not an isolated bad decision. It was consistent with a pattern of Celsius prioritizing yield over safety, taking on counterparty risk, concentration risk, and liquidity risk that a company actually committed to protecting depositors would not have taken on at that scale. The examiner's report also addressed the CEL token, the cryptocurrency that Celsius had issued and that Mashinsky and other executives held in substantial quantities. The token had been actively promoted by Celsius, with the platform offering higher yields to depositors who chose to receive their interest payments in CEL rather than in the underlying asset. This created demand for CEL, which supported its price. But the examiner found evidence suggesting that Celsius itself was a significant buyer of CEL in the open market, effectively using depositor assets to support the price of a token that was benefiting insiders, a practice that created obvious conflicts of interest between the company's obligations to depositors and the financial interests of its executives. Mashinsky alone held a very large quantity of CEL tokens. Every dollar of support that Celsius provided to the CEL price through market purchases was, in some sense, a transfer of value from depositors to the founder, a transfer that was not disclosed. The picture that emerged was not of a company that had made some bad investments in a difficult market and been caught out by circumstances beyond its control. It was of a company that had been systematically mismanaging depositor assets, taking on risks it was not disclosing, while its founder presented a public face of confidence and competence that had no relationship to the internal reality.
The regulators had arrived, and they were not coming to help.
January 2023. As the bankruptcy was grinding through its initial phases and depositors were waiting to learn how much of their money might be recovered, federal prosecutors in the Southern District of New York and the Commodity Futures Trading Commission were building their cases. The charges that landed on Mashinsky in July 2023 were the product of a multi-agency investigation that included the Department of Justice, the SEC, and the CFTC. The DOJ charged Mashinsky with 7 counts of fraud and market manipulation. The CFTC filed separately.
The criminal charges were specific and serious. The DOJ alleged that Mashinsky had made false and misleading statements to depositors in the Friday AMA sessions, in interviews, in tweets, in public statements of all kinds about the safety of deposits, the nature of Celsius's investment strategy, and the financial health of the company. It alleged that he had manipulated the price of the CEL token by making misleading public statements about Celsius's business to prop up the token price, while he and other insiders were selling their own CEL holdings. And it alleged that these actions caused billions of dollars of harm to the customers who had trusted him. Mashinsky's arrest, he was taken into custody in New York on July 13th, 2023, was both dramatic and, in the context of the losses suffered by depositors, somehow not dramatic enough. The image of the man who had spent years positioning himself as the champion of ordinary people against predatory financial institutions being walked out in handcuffs was the kind of irony that would be too heavy-handed in fiction. He was released on bail. His legal team entered a not guilty plea. The defense position, broadly, was that the markets were unpredictable, that Celsius had faced circumstances beyond its control, and that Mashinsky had genuinely believed in the business and its ability to weather the storms it encountered. The argument was, essentially, that bad outcomes don't equal bad intent, that a failed business is not the same as a fraud. The government's response to this argument was documented in the evidence it had collected during its investigation. The internal communications, the emails, the Slack messages, the internal reports showed a company whose senior leadership was aware of serious financial problems, while its founder was publicly denying those problems existed. The gap between what Mashinsky said on camera and what his own team was telling him internally was, the government argued, not the result of ignorance or optimism. It was the result of a decision to deceive. In December 2023, as his criminal trial date approached, Mashinsky changed course. He entered a guilty plea to 2 counts, 1 count of commodities fraud and 1 count of fraud related to the manipulation of the CEL token. The plea came with the understanding that Mashinsky was admitting that he had made material misrepresentations to Celsius customers and had manipulated the CEL token market in ways that benefited himself at depositors' expense. The sentencing was scheduled for 2024, with federal guidelines suggesting a significant prison term. The man who had built a platform around the idea of being different from the corrupt financial establishment had, the legal system concluded, been running his own version of the thing he claimed to hate. But the legal proceedings were only one dimension of the reckoning. The other dimension was the one that didn't have courtrooms or guilty pleas. The bankruptcy proceedings of Celsius Network are one of the more complex corporate insolvencies in American legal history. The combination of the novel nature of cryptocurrency assets, the jurisdictional complexity of a global depositor base, the opacity of the underlying financial positions, and the sheer number of creditors made the case extraordinarily difficult to resolve. Here's the basic problem the bankruptcy court faced. Celsius owed customers approximately $11.8 billion in crypto assets at the time of the freeze. The actual value of the assets Celsius held was far less than that, partly because of realized losses on bad deployments, partly because of the general decline in crypto prices that had occurred between when many deposits were made and when the bankruptcy was filed, and partly because of the costs associated with the bankruptcy process itself. The people who had deposited assets and were now waiting to find out how much they'd recover were not a monolithic group. Some had deposited stablecoins, cryptocurrencies pegged to the dollar, and were owed specific dollar amounts. Others had deposited Bitcoin, Ethereum, or other cryptocurrencies whose values had declined significantly since deposit. The treatment of different categories of depositor and the question of what exactly customers were owed consumed enormous legal resources and produced court proceedings that most depositors found incomprehensible. The mechanics of the recovery were, in the end, partial and painful. The bankruptcy plan that was eventually approved allowed creditors to recover some portion of their deposits in a mix of crypto assets and equity in a restructured company, but the recovery rates were significantly below 100 cents on the dollar. The exact recovery percentage varied by creditor class, but most retail depositors recovered substantially less than what they had deposited, particularly when accounting for the decline in crypto prices during the period between deposit and distribution. The human stories attached to these numbers were documented by journalists, shared in online communities, and submitted in court filings. A software engineer in California who had used Celsius to accumulate a down payment on a house found that by the time the bankruptcy distributions were made, the value of what he received was not enough for the purpose he'd been saving toward. A small business owner in Florida who had moved operating reserves into Celsius for the yield found herself scrambling for liquidity in the months after the freeze while waiting for a bankruptcy process that moved on a timeline utterly indifferent to her business needs. The geographic spread of the losses was global. Celsius had operated in dozens of countries, including many where the depositor base included people for whom the amounts deposited represented a higher proportion of their total wealth than would be typical for American retail investors. In countries with currency instability, where crypto had been adopted partly as a hedge against local currency risk, the Celsius collapse hit people who had few alternative stores of value. The class of depositors who were most acutely harmed by the cell token manipulation were those who had been persuaded by Mashinsky's public promotion of the token and by the higher yields offered for cell interest payments to accumulate significant cell holdings. When the cell price collapsed along with the platform, these depositors lost not just the principal of their crypto deposits, but also the value of the cell tokens they had accumulated as interest payments. The thing that was supposed to represent the bonus of choosing Celsius's ecosystem turned out to be the instrument through which they lost additional value. And somewhere in all of this, the question that kept surfacing was one that the legal proceedings couldn't fully answer. Who else knew? The story of Celsius is, in one narrow reading, the story of a single charismatic founder who made promises he couldn't keep and told lies to conceal the gap. That reading is true, but insufficient. It lets too many other people off too easily. Celsius raised significant institutional funding from professional venture capital and growth equity investors. The company's fundraising history included rounds at valuations that required investors to assess the sustainability of the business model, to understand at least roughly how Celsius was generating the yields it was promising, and whether those yields could be maintained. The investors who participated in these rounds had access to financial information, management teams, and diligence processes that were not available to the retail depositors. What the due diligence process apparently did not adequately uncover was the deployment strategy, the specific ways in which Celsius was deploying depositor assets in order to generate the yields the platform was promising. A rigorous examination of where the assets were going, what the counterparty exposures looked like, what the liquidity risk profile was, would have revealed a business that was taking on risks inconsistent with the promises it was making to depositors. Some investors will say they were misled, that the information provided to them was inaccurate in ways that precluded effective due diligence. That may well be true, but the broader question, whether the diligence done matched the scale of the risk being taken on, is one that the Celsius situation raises in ways that the venture capital community has not fully addressed. The crypto media ecosystem, which had been a significant amplifier of Celsius's narrative during the growth phase, was part of the system too. Influencers and YouTube personalities who had promoted Celsius to their audiences in exchange for promotional arrangements that were not always clearly disclosed had contributed to the pool of trust that retail depositors drew on when they decided to put their savings on the platform. The disclosure practices around paid crypto promotions were, in 2021 and 2022, notably inadequate by the standards of financial advertising regulation. Rating agencies and risk assessment platforms that had assigned favorable scores to Celsius's creditworthiness and operational soundness based on self-reported information and criteria that were not designed to assess the specific risks of a crypto yield platform had lent a veneer of third-party validation to claims that deserved far more skepticism. The regulatory gap is part of this picture too. Celsius had operated in a space that was not clearly regulated by any single authority. It was not a bank, and therefore not subject to banking regulation. It was not a registered investment advisor, and therefore not subject to SEC investment management rules. It was not a commodity pool, and therefore argued it was not subject to CFTC oversight. The regulatory gray zone that crypto platforms occupied during this period allowed Celsius to make promises that would not have been legal for a regulated financial institution to make without disclosures and capital requirements that would have changed the economics of the business entirely. In September 2023, the SEC reached settlements with several former Celsius executives relating to the unregistered securities offering that the platform's interest-bearing accounts had constituted. The settlements produced fines and industry bans, but not the level of individual accountability that many depositors felt the situation warranted. The legal process for these civil cases moved slowly and produced outcomes that, to people who had lost significant portions of their savings, felt calibrated more to institutional norms than to the scale of the harm. The gap between institutional accountability and the accountability that ordinary people experience every time the legal system processes a corporate failure, that gap is its own story, one that Celsius writes another chapter of. Celsius didn't happen in a vacuum. It happened in a specific moment in financial and cultural history. And understanding that moment is part of understanding why so many intelligent, financially aware people made the decision to deposit money on the platform. The period from roughly 2020 to 2022 was one of the most extraordinary bull markets in crypto history. Bitcoin hit $69,000. Ethereum hit $4,800. The total market capitalization of all crypto assets briefly exceeded $3 trillion. NFTs were selling for millions. Crypto projects with little evident utility were achieving valuations that defied conventional analysis. The entire asset class had gone in the public consciousness from a speculative fringe experiment to a mainstream financial phenomenon in what felt like a matter of months. In that environment, the promise of a platform that would let you earn 8 or 10 or 17% on your crypto holdings, while the assets themselves were potentially appreciating, felt like a legitimate opportunity rather than a red flag. The conventional financial sector was still offering savings account rates that hovered near zero. The crypto space was offering returns that looked, by comparison, extraordinary. The catch that wasn't being adequately explained was that those yields required taking risks that weren't being disclosed. The 17% return wasn't coming from some efficient magic of blockchain technology. It was coming from lending depositor assets to counterparties in a market that was, during the bull phase, generating high returns because leverage was everywhere and liquidity was cheap. When the market turned, the leverage unwound, the liquidity evaporated, and the counterparties who had been paying high rates found themselves unable to. The model that produced 17% in a rising market produced catastrophic losses in a falling one. That's not unique to crypto. It's a feature of any highly leveraged financial ecosystem where the returns in the good times come from risks that are only fully visible in the bad times. What was unique to Celsius and the broader crypto yield space was the combination of inadequate disclosure, inadequate regulation, and a marketing strategy that actively encouraged depositors not to think about the risks. The community dynamics that Celsius cultivated were, in retrospect, a specific kind of vulnerability. Mashinsky's Friday AMAs, the Celsius community forums, the social media groups, these created an ecosystem of mutual reinforcement in which people who were skeptical of the platform were characterized as bad actors or people who didn't understand the technology. The community policed its own skepticism. People who asked hard questions were told they didn't understand DeFi, or that they were falling for FUD, or that they were being manipulated by the platform's competitors.
This dynamic, common in online communities built around financial products, made it psychologically and socially costly to express doubt. The people who had doubts didn't raise them publicly. The people who expressed confidence were validated. The community's collective information environment was distorted in the direction of optimism, and that distorted environment affected individual decision-making. This is not a new phenomenon. It is not unique to crypto. It is the dynamics of any community built around a shared financial bet, where the community's enthusiasm becomes a reason to maintain the bet past the point where individual rational analysis would counsel exit. What was different about crypto, and about Celsius specifically, was the scale at which this phenomenon operated, the speed at which it amplified, and the global reach of the platforms that hosted it. When the freeze happened, 1.7 million people found out simultaneously that the community had been wrong. And the silence of the Sunday morning announcement, with no warning and no preparation and no path to answers, was the loneliest possible way to discover it. Let's be honest about the limits of what the legal process can do to the harm that Celsius caused. Mashinsky's guilty plea established criminal responsibility for specific conduct. The sentencing that followed imposed consequences on him personally. The SEC and CFTC settlements produced fines and industry bans for other executives. The bankruptcy process distributed whatever assets remained to depositors according to a legally supervised plan. None of this gives back to the nurse in Ohio the $340,000 she saved over 20 years. None of it restores the value that was lost by the thousands of people in developing countries who used Celsius as their primary financial savings vehicle. None of it compensates for the months of frozen access during which people couldn't pay bills, couldn't fund medical expenses, couldn't meet obligations they had been counting on their Celsius deposits to support. The financial harm is partially quantifiable. The non-financial harm, the anxiety, the relationship damage, the lost opportunities, the specific ways in which this loss changed the trajectories of individual lives, is not. What does get left behind, beyond the losses, is a set of questions that the financial and regulatory system has to answer if something like Celsius isn't going to happen again. The most important question is the one about what a yield means. When a financial platform offers you a yield, 8, 10, 17% annually, the yield is not a fact about the asset. It is a claim about the return that the platform can generate by deploying that asset in specific ways. Understanding a yield requires understanding the deployment strategy. Understanding the deployment strategy requires disclosure. The disclosure framework that allowed Celsius to promise 17% returns without explaining how those returns were generated, without allowing depositors to assess whether the deployment strategy was consistent with the risk profile they were accepting, was not adequate. Fixing it requires regulatory frameworks that mandate disclosure of deployment strategies in ways that are comprehensible to the retail investors using these platforms. The second question is about the regulatory perimeter. Celsius operated in the gap between banking regulation and securities regulation and commodities regulation. And that gap allowed it to make promises that no regulated financial institution could have made without meeting capital, disclosure, and operational standards that would have constrained the business model significantly. Closing that gap, defining clearly what a crypto yield platform is and what regulatory standards apply to it, is the most direct structural fix that the Celsius situation demands. The third question is about the relationship between marketing and reality. The Friday AMA sessions, the community management, the social media presence, these were tools for building trust that were then deployed in the service of a business whose actual characteristics were materially different from what the trust building implied.
Mashinsky's personal brand and Celsius's community brand were assets that were used to generate deposits that the platform then deployed in ways those depositors hadn't consented to. Whether the legal framework for financial product marketing adequately addresses this dynamic, the use of personality and community to generate trust as a substitute for transparent disclosure, is a question that regulators need to answer more definitively than they have. The fourth question is the one that doesn't have an institutional answer. It's the question about what it means to give someone your trust. Mashinsky understood that the depositors he was reaching were not primarily making financial calculations. They were making trust decisions. They were deciding whether to believe in a person and a story. The marketing was designed to generate trust, not to generate understanding. People who don't fully understand the risks they're taking are more likely to take risks they wouldn't otherwise accept. That gap between the trust that Celsius cultivated and the understanding it didn't provide is where the billions went.
Celsius positioned itself as the alternative to predatory finance. In the end, it was predatory finance in a baseball cap. The cap said, "Banks are not your friends." He was right about that. He just didn't mention that neither was he. There are people who woke up on June 12, 2022 with more than $1 million in Celsius, and by the end of the bankruptcy had recovered a fraction of it. There are people for whom the loss was not catastrophic, who had money elsewhere, who could absorb it, who are today doing fine. And there are people for whom that Sunday morning changed everything, who made decisions based on what they believed Celsius was, and who are still dealing with the consequences of those decisions years later. The crypto industry, in the period since the Celsius collapse, has absorbed the lesson in the selective way that industries tend to absorb expensive lessons. There is more regulatory engagement, at least in some jurisdictions. There is more caution, at least temporarily, about platforms promising extraordinary yields. There is a wariness that wasn't there before. Whether that wariness survives the next bull market, the next period when prices are rising and the returns look extraordinary, and someone with a baseball cap and a YouTube channel is telling you that this time it's different, that the system is changing, that you'd be a fool to sit it out, is the question that the Celsius story can't answer. It can only ask it. Alex Mashinsky built something that millions of people trusted. He built it on a foundation that he understood, and they didn't, was not solid. The yield was real, until it wasn't. The community was real, even when the finances weren't. The trust was real, and it was real right up to the moment the announcement went up on the blog on a Sunday morning in June. And then the trust was gone, along with the money. The rebuilding of the first takes years. The second, for many of those 1.7 million people, never fully came back. That's what happens when someone mistakes your savings for their chips and plays the game without telling you the stakes. If you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Every click helps us bring more untold stories into the light. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next Dark Ledger investigation.